How many years did I aspire to be the you in that song? Amazing. Don't you just love those segments on the national news where the child's participating in some community activity and then is surprised by his or her father just home from deployment? Or mother? The joy displayed by those children always brings tears to my eyes. On the other hand, many fathers do not get their just due. Take the case of the mother and son coming through an airport. That mother was overheard telling her 9-year-old son, "Jacob, now remember, run to Dad first and then to the dog." But then again, there have been situations where the dog played a greater role in the child's life than did the father. And John Wooden, the famous basketball coach, wrote, "Being a role model is the most powerful form of educating. Too often, fathers neglect it because they get so caught up in making a living that they forget to make a life." There was a first grader who became curious about her father bringing home a briefcase full of papers every night. Her mother explained, "Daddy has so much to do that he can't finish it all at the office. That's why he has to work at night." "Well then," said the child, "why don't they put him into a slower group?" Ah, the wisdom of children. Children do pay attention to the way their fathers react to the world. After the church service, a little boy told the pastor, "When I grow up, I'm going to give you some money." "Well, thank you," the pastor replied. "But why?" "Because my daddy says you're one of the poorest preachers we've ever had." Now, Dr. Michael Gurian is a marriage and family counselor in private practice, and he's also a best-selling author. He wrote, "Father's Day is hopefully a time when the culture says, this is our moment to look at who our men and boys are." Well, this is Father's Day. Do we know who our men and boys are? If you were here on Mother's Day, you may remember me quoting the humorist Richard Armour, who said, "It all started with Eve." Now, unless we're going to question the literal inerrancy of the Bible, we can't argue with that. So I agree, it did start with Eve. I just don't know who Eve was. And I don't know who Adam was either. But I do believe that Eve could not have done it without Adam. Now, I don't want to get wrapped up in the biological details, so we'll just look at it metaphysically. In the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, Charles Fillmore, from here on referred to as the Father of Unity, explained the metaphysical meanings of Adam and Eve. Eve represents the feeling nature present in each of us. Mr. Fillmore describes this as the mother principle of God in expression. Adam, on the other hand, represents our intellectual nature. This is the father principle of God. And I can't help thinking this is just a little bit sexist, and that probably means that I have a bit of an ego problem. The suggestion I once heard was that I was passive-aggressive suggests that I hesitate to let my feelings show. And the Father of Unity tells me that the I am puts feeling into what it thinks. And if that's not happening in my consciousness, my wisdom faculty is not showing up. I'm not a well-rounded expression of the I am. Now, Robert Frost put it in a way some of us may understand a little more clearly. He said, "The father is always a Republican toward his son, and his mother's always a Democrat." Now, about that, Mr. Fillmore would simply say, "We need more bipartisanship." And we might ask Robert Frost about our daughters. They, as well as sons, need bipartisan upbringing. It's all about wholeness. The best way to instill wholeness in our children is to model wholeness for our children. And this is probably why many Unity True students refer to Mother-Father God. Now, I'm in denial. I've got a lot to learn about wholeness. But I did confess on Mother's Day that I do have a feminine side to my nature. It's been suggested that I need to let it out a little more, even to the good old boys I've been hiding it from. So it may have started with Eve, our feeling nature, but until Adam, our thinking nature, works together with Eve, there is no wholeness. It's in the Bible, if we look at it metaphysically. Now, in Unity, we think of the Bible as one of our textbooks. So what does the Bible teach us about parenting? Well, unfortunately, almost nothing. Adam and Eve begat Cain and Abel, but the Bible says nothing of their parenting. We can't blame Adam and Eve for Cain's murder of his brother Abel. We don't know what, if anything, they taught their children. Now, guess who was the second father in the Bible story? We know that Cain begat, but the Bible says nothing about his parenting. And after that, there were several generations of begats, but not a word about parenting. And then we get to Noah, who put a curse on his own son Ham because Ham had seen him naked while he was drunk. Now there's a lesson in parenting. Then there were more begats. It seems the biblical males' only roles were to beget whenever they weren't fighting battles. Surely there must be something better. How about Abraham? He was the one to whom God promised the land of Canaan. And God expected Abraham to charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. Abraham must have done that. Did that make him a good father? Well, it depends on what you call good. First, Abraham sent his firstborn son Ishmael and the boy's mother into exile in the wilderness. Well, Abraham did feel guilty about that, but he did it anyway. And he got over the guilt because God said it was okay. He'd just done what his wife had told him to do. What a good guy. Now, this was the very same God who then commanded Abraham to sacrifice his second son, Isaac, on the altar. God let him off the hook for that, but only after Abraham proved he was committed to do it. Not my idea of a good God. And not my idea of a good father. Oh well, it was the way of the time. Now, Abraham had a nephew named Lot. Lot was a good father too, according to the way of the time. Must run in the family. Lot was the father who offered to let the mob have its way with his own daughters in order to distract them from the male guests in his house. And that story ended with those same daughters seducing their father because they were afraid that was the only way they could have children. All the men of Sodom and Gomorrah had been wiped out by God. What else could they do? Now, you should know that domestic violence is not just a 21st century phenomenon. And I must say, when I first took the time to read the Bible, I went into shock. There was a lot of detail that never showed up in my Bible story books. Let's face it, everything the Bible has described is probably myth anyway, but the stories the writers chose to tell is a reflection of the ways of the times in which they wrote. It explains ideas they thought were important. Apparently, they didn't think fatherhood was a very big deal. Obviously, the men had more important things to do. Now, value systems had evolved by the time of the New Testament. People's perceptions of God had evolved. Perhaps the writers of the Gospels gave more attention to fatherhood. Let us take the case of Joseph, the father of Jesus. Actually, there's no place in the Gospels that calls Joseph the father of Jesus. Luke in one verse said that Jesus was the son of Joseph. John said the same in 2 verses. Matthew simply spoke of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. In all, the Gospels mention Joseph 15 times. Mark didn't mention Joseph at all. The only mention of Joseph as a parent was his protecting Jesus by fleeing to Egypt to avoid the massacre of the innocents. After that, Joseph doesn't show up in the Bible again. So much for parenting in the Bible. The Bible does cover childing. The 5th of the 10 Commandments tells us to honor our fathers and our mothers. And it's important to note that this requirement is not limited to one day each year. Now, one father asked a friend what Bible verse he would use to guide him in his parenting. His answer, "Thou shalt not kill." I think we can do better than that. As Rodney Dangerfield would have said, fathers don't get no respect. And history supports Rodney's assertion. There have been fathers for millions of years, yet the first official Father's Day was established only in 1966. I think that was a bit overdue. Now, one company sponsored an essay contest for kids. The theme was, "The nicest thing my father ever did for me." And the winner wrote, "He married my mother." There is some logic in that, but perhaps that child should have spent a little longer thinking about it. A little girl and her parents were sitting around the table eating supper one evening, and little Kathy piped up, "Daddy, you're the boss, aren't you?" That made her dad feel pretty proud and validated. He smiled and said yes. But then Kathy continued, "That's because Mommy put you in charge, isn't it?" Now, most fathers do their best to teach their children to be honest. And the payback is not always what they hope for. Betty Girl sat in her daddy's lap as he read her a bedtime story. Guess who was known as Betty Girl when she was little? Anyway, every once in a while she took her eyes off the book and reached up to touch Dad's wrinkled cheek. Then she began alternately stroking her own cheek and his again. Finally she asked, "Daddy, did God make you?" "Yes, sweetheart," he answered. "God made me a long time ago." "Oh," she said. Then, "Daddy, did God make me too?" "Yes, indeed," he assured her. "God made you a little while ago." "Oh," she said. She felt both faces again. "God's better at it now, isn't he?" Well, perhaps the nicest thing my father did for me was to marry my mother. If that hadn't happened, there would be no me. I'm grateful. Now, whether my father was a good parent depends on whom you ask. My older brother never forgave my father for the way he was raised. And I think it's important for all of us to consider the circumstances of our upbringing. My brother grew up at the height of the Depression. The family struggled financially. In fact, my family worshipped at the shrine of lack and limitation. And I grew up during a period of recovery, and my brother saw me getting more material rewards than he ever did. And on top of that, my dad was very sports-minded. And my brother didn't do well at sports and therefore showed little interest. But like Dad, I was sports-minded, and Dad spent hours throwing a football with me. And my dad suffered from bursitis in his throwing shoulder, but he seldom turned me down when I asked for his attention. And I always appreciated my dad telling me that I had the talent to do better. My brother took similar comments as criticism. So whether or not Dad is a good parent is often in the mind of the beholder. There was a successful attorney who told this story. "The greatest gift I ever received was a gift I got one Christmas when my dad gave me a small box. Inside was a note saying, 'Son, this year I will give you a minimum of 365 hours, an hour every day after dinner. It's yours. We'll talk about what you want to talk about. We'll go where you want to go and play what you want to play. It will be your hour.' My dad not only kept his promise, but every year he renewed it. It's the greatest gift I ever had in my life. I am the result of his time." Now, when I became a parent, it was strictly OJT, on-the-job training. My only real qualification I had was my commitment to be the best parent I could be. I made parenting my number one priority. Now, I hadn't yet developed a prosperity consciousness, So I was determined to give my daughter the only thing I was sure I had, my time. Boy, did I give her my time. And it turned out to be a good investment. Now Amy is the mother of my 3 grandchildren. I must have done something right. Her values are very much like mine. Occasionally she even confesses that although she had argued with me, sometimes I was right. And in my opinion, she's turned out to be a better parent than I was. Now, last month on Mother's Day, I spoke of Myrtle Fillmore as the mother of Unity. There's no doubt about that. Myrtle Fillmore was the true founder of the Unity movement. It was her healing that provided the impetus. However, Myrtle kept a relatively low profile, and Unity might never have spread beyond the Fillmore's neighborhood had it not been for the work of her husband. Myrtle led prayer and meditation groups, mostly among friends and neighbors, but Charles did most of the speaking and writing. That was the New Thought lecture by E.B. Weeks that changed Myrtle's life. That Charles was so preoccupied with finances that he found the lecture interesting, but other than that, it had little impact on his life. He would have thought no more about that lecture, but he was impressed not only with Myrtle's miraculous recovery, but also with her success in guiding the healings of several neighbors. That got his attention, and he began to study New Thought, and the religions of the world, wondering if he could heal his own condition. Now, Charles had been lame with a damaged hip that resulted from an ice skating accident when he was 10 years old. The several doctors he was taken to gave him no relief. It was 2 years before he could even walk, and then he had a pronounced limp for many years. He had to wear an iron brace on his right leg, and then he began to lose the sight in his right eye. Well, Reverend Jim Gaither wrote, Charles Fillmore drew his conclusions from experimentation and observation of his own psychological state in relation to his own physical states and experiences. Charles himself said, "If I am spirit, and this God they talk about so much is spirit, we can somehow communicate, or the whole thing is fraud." Charles began to meditate. It took time, but he eventually got to the point where he could just sit down and immediately go into the silence. And he said, "I sat in the silence every night at a certain hour and tried to get in touch with God. I was there on time every night and tried in all conceivable ways to realize that my mind was in touch with the Supreme Mind. At first, I didn't seem to get any conscious result. But I kept at it month after month, mentally affirming words the others told me would open the way until it got to be a habit, and I rather enjoyed it. After months and months of trying, Charles finally began to feel results. He said, my chronic pains ceased. My hip healed and grew stronger. In addition, the vision in his right eye began to improve. Now Charles was ready to begin the movement, to join the movement. He said, my interest became so pronounced that I neglected my real estate business for the furtherance of what my friends denounced as fanatical delusion. That is how Charles became one of the co-founders of the Unity movement, the father of Unity. Not only was Charles Fillmore the father of Unity, he was also the father of 3 sons. One measure of positive parenting is the way in which the children support the work of their parents. All 3 sons played active roles in the development of the Unity movement. Lowell Fillmore succeeded his father as president of Unity School. Rickert Fillmore drew up the architectural plans for the construction of Unity Village. Royal Fillmore was very active in the youth education program. And I'd say that their level of participation indicates positive parenting on the parts of Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. Now, I was not a perfect father. I'm proud of my commitment, but I made a lot of mistakes. I didn't do too badly considering the training I had. And I learned from my mistakes, and I've tried not to make the same ones again and again. And I think I've got it figured out now that Amy is on her own and has her own family to raise. And if I had to do it all over again, thank God I don't. But if I had to do it all over again, I'd start with this reprint from an old Ann Landers column. If I had my child to raise all over again, I'd build self-esteem first and the house later. I'd finger paint more and point the finger less. I'd do less correcting and more connecting. I'd take my eyes off my watch and watch with my eyes. I would care to know less and know to care more. I'd take more hikes and fly more kites. I'd stop playing serious and seriously play. Would run through more fields and gaze at more stars. I'd do more hugging and less tugging. I'd see the oak tree and the acorn more. I'd be firm less often and affirm much more. I'd model less about the love of power and more about the power of love. And then I would make that my commitment. God bless Papa Charles Fillmore. God bless all you fathers. And God bless the mothers who gave us the opportunity to be fathers. And God bless all those children without whom the whole idea is irrelevant. God bless you all.